welcome to the Rob Burgess Show. I'm, of course, your host, Rob Burgess. On this, our 263rd episode, our returning guest is Thom Hartmann. You first heard Thom Hartmann on episode 233 of the podcast. Thom Hartmann is the four-time Project Censored Award-winning, New York Times best-selling author of 25 books, currently in print in over a dozen languages on 5 continents. Hartmann is also an internationally known speaker on culture and communications, an author and an innovator in the fields of psychiatry, ecology, and economics. The co-founder with his wife, Louise, and former executive director of the New England Salem Children's Village, 1978, and the Hunter School, 1997. He has led national innovations in the areas of residential treatment for abused children and private and public education for learning disabled children. He has helped set up hospitals, famine relief programs, schools, and refugee centers in India, Uganda, Australia, Colombia, Russia, and the United States through the German-based Salem International Program. Formerly rostered with the state of Vermont as a psychotherapist, founder of the Michigan Healing Arts Center, and licensed as an NLP trainer by Richard Bandler, who wrote the foreword to one of Thom's books. He was the originator of the revolutionary hunter/farmer hypothesis to understand the psychiatric condition known as Attention Deficit Hyperactive Disorder, or ADHD. A guest faculty member at the Goddard School in Vermont, he also synthesized the younger/older culture model for describing the underpinnings and possible solutions to the world's ecological and socio-political crises, suggesting that many of our problems are grounded in cultural stories which go back thousands of years. Leonardo DiCaprio was inspired by Thom's book, The Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight, to make the movie The 11th Hour, in which Thom appears, and a series of environmental videos narrated by Hartmann and DiCaprio, available at Green World Rising. Talkers magazine named Thom Hartmann as the most important progressive talk show host in America for the past decade, and for 3 of the past 5 years the #1 most important progressive host, in their Heavy 100 ranking. His radio show is syndicated on for-profit radio stations nationwide by WYD Media, on nonprofit and community stations nationwide by Pacifica, across the entire North American continent on Sirius XM satellite radio, on cable systems nationwide by Cable Radio Network, CRN, and Free Speech TV on its own YouTube channel, via subscription podcasts worldwide through the U.S. American Forces Network and through the Thom Hartmann app in the App Store. The radio show is also simulcast as TV in real time into nearly 60 million U.S. and Canadian homes by the Free Speech TV network on Dish Network, DirecTV, and cable TV systems nationwide. From 2010 to 2017, Hartmann hosted a 1-hour daily TV program, The Big Picture with Thom Hartmann, which was editorially directed by his wife and was broadcast from the Washington, D.C. studios of the RT America News Network. As an entrepreneur, he's founded several successful businesses which are still operating, and lived and worked with his wife and their 3 now adult children on several continents. He was born in Michigan and retains strong ties to the Midwest, although he has lived in many regions. He now lives on the Columbia River in Portland, Oregon. His new book, The Hidden History of the American Dream, The Demise of the Middle Class, and How to Rescue Our Future, was published October 8th, 2024. And now on to the show. I just finished your book today, and by finished it today, I meant I started it and finished it today, because I like the length of your books. You know what I mean? You're in, you're out, you make your points. You know?
Thank you. Yeah, that was our goal, was to make very readable books in this,
100%.
Day and age of short attention spans.
Absolutely. 100%. Yeah, you definitely take on an important topic here. One that, you know, I'm a millennial, and so I feel very deeply a lot of the subjects that you decide to cover here. It's amazing how much has changed in between the time of, you know, my parents when they were my age and now. You know, it's staggering to think about all the structural differences between those generations. So I think,
yeah, it really is.
You do start at a very interesting place here in the book, talking about the American dream and kind of the genesis of that and kind of how we got to where we are today. For about 50 years, from FDR to Reagan, roughly, we had some sort of a middle class carved out in this country that allowed for an American dream. And I don't think a lot of people think about what went into that or why that was made possible. So, can you talk a little bit about the conditions from which this was able to happen?
Yeah. When let me back up a little bit. Back in the 1700s, at the
Backing
time of
up
the
a little
American,
bit.
yeah, at the time of the American Revolution, um, there were two competing theories about government. One was that the principal job of government should be to basically, pave the way for capitalism, to at the very most, provide an army, a court system, the police, and maybe a little bit of infrastructure. The other, and that was, fairly widely held. And the other perspective was written about by Adam Smith in his book, Theory of Moral Sentiments, and briefly mentioned in his book, well, actually, it was in several of his books, but um, the Wealth of Nations was probably his most famous. But in A Theory of Moral Sentiments, he just came right out and said, the purpose of government should be to provide for the maximum welfare of the maximum number of people, which is what the founders incorporated into the Constitution. The General Welfare Clause, which is in Article 1, and also is is mentioned in the preamble of the Constitution. So basically, from the founding of the Republic until really the Republican Great Depression, the early 1930s, late 1920s, early 1930s, that was what happened. And we had, a fairly poor populace. We had what normally you get when you have unregulated capitalism, when you have very little government intervention in the marketplace. And that's the world that Charles Dickens wrote about in the book, The Christmas Carol, for example. You have the top 1%, the royal family, the very, very wealthy, who control probably 80-90% of all the wealth in the country. You have a very small middle class, 2, 3, 4, 5% at the most, who are doctors and lawyers and professional people and shopkeepers and small business owners. Scrooge, Ebenezer Scrooge, in that book, was a small business owner. It was such a small business, he only had one employee. And then the bottom 95% of the population is the working poor. And in fact, England was so enthusiastic about this that right up until the mid 19th century, there were maximum wage laws in England. You could go to jail if you paid your employees more than a certain amount, because they did not want a middle class to emerge. And there were a number of philosophers who wrote about this, and economists. Edmund Burke is probably the most famous. He was a British economist around the time of the American Revolution, who argued he was not a fan of the maximum wage laws because he thought there should be no government intervention in the marketplace. But he was very clear that he thought there should be classes and orders in society, his phrase, and that he was just fine with 95% of the people being dirt poor. That would ensure a stable society. So by the census of 1900 in the United States, we had maybe 10% of the population was in the middle class, maybe a little more, actually, depending on how you define the middle class, because up until that point, land had been fairly cheap because we were just stealing it from the Indians. But the average person did not have anything close to the middle class lifestyle that we consider today. And by 1932, 33, I think it was up to around 14 or 15% was in the middle class. So FDR came along and he said, this is crazy. As Adam Smith wrote back at the time of the American Revolution, I mean, literally in 1776, that was when Wealth of Nations was published. The job of government is to maximize benefit for the most number of people, without kneecapping business. I mean, we do want capitalism. It's a great way to create wealth, but we want to do it in a way that helps most people. And so FDR put into place a whole bunch of programs, the minimum wage, he legalized unions, unemployment insurance, essentially the 5-day work week, the 40-hour week. All of these programs. He proposed a national healthcare system. He started the process of education being free, college education being free. He strengthened the school systems across the country. And so by 1981, when Reagan was sworn into office, about 2/3 of us were in the middle class, which is a pretty amazing accomplishment. The problem was that back in 1951, a fellow by the name of Russell Kirk wrote a book which is today considered the Bible of the modern day conservative movement. It was called The Conservative Mind. And the subtitle is From Burke to Eliot, from Edmund Burke to T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot was an early 20th century conservative. And Edmund Burke, of course, from the late 1700s. And in that book, Kirk basically, in fact, the entire first chapter is echoing Burke, with warnings about the middle class. And while Kirk himself didn't explicitly say this, it was many of the people around him were writing about this. The main people who were all excited about Kirk's book were William F. Buckley Jr. and Barry Goldwater. And this caused Buckley to write an op-ed for the National Review, a rather famous op-ed in which he argued that the apartheid that the United States had in the 1950s should be maintained because Black people were genetically inferior. And if they ever tried to have an equal role with white people, it would create chaos in society. So there were basically 3 warnings that conservatives were making based on Kirk's book. Number one, that if the middle class ever got too large, you would see minorities demanding rights, and they really weren't prepared to make use of those rights, which was Buckley's argument. Number two, that if the middle class got too large, women would no longer be content with their role in the family, basically in the bedroom and in the kitchen. And number three, that if the middle class ever got too large, and this was also an argument against free college, that young people would rebel. And in each one of these 3 cases, the result would be social chaos and even arguably the end of the American Republic. So then came the 60s. In 1961, the FDA legalized the birth control pill. And so by 1965, because women could now control their fertility, there was a full-blown women's movement demanding rights in the workplace. So there went the women. By 66, 67, you had a full-blown anti-Vietnam War movement. Young men were burning their draft cards. There were those young people rebelling and ignoring their elders, one of the conservative warnings, imprecations. And then, of course, you had the peak of the civil rights movement. And when King was assassinated, you even had American cities on fire. So I view all those things, those 3 things, as kind of the birth pains of the next great evolution in American society, moving forward. But conservatives looked at this in the 1960s, and at that time we were about 50% of us were in the middle class. Conservatives looked at that and said, holy crap, what this means is that, or Russell Kirk and his followers, what this means is that if the middle class gets very much larger, we're going to see the end of America. It's going to be absolute social chaos, and who knows, we might even end up a communist country or be conquered by the USSR. There was a very real fear of communism back then. So at that point, they said the guys who had laughed at Russell Kirk in 51 when his book was published were suddenly saying, oh my, this guy was a prophet. So when Reagan came into office in 1981, 2/3 of us were in the middle class, and the social ferment was continuing. You had, the hippie movement and the psychedelic movement. Again, it looked like young people were out of control. The women's movement had actually gotten stronger and more powerful. And the minority rights movement had gained considerable steam after the passage in 64 and 65 of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And so Reagan's job when he came into office was to cut the middle class down to size, to save the Union, to protect America from the chaos that was coming out of too big a middle class. And so, he did a bunch of things to accomplish that. In the first months of his administration, he went after one of the only 3 unions that had actually endorsed him, the Air Traffic Controllers Union, PATCO, and decertified the union, destroyed the union, fired all the controllers. He gutted our college education system. You could go to college for free prior to that in many parts of the United States and the entire state of California. He had done away with that as governor of California, but his first year, he cut the federal education budget by 18%. Back then, I went to college in the 60s. I didn't graduate, but I went for a while. And I was able to put myself through college at Lansing Community College and then Michigan State University by working as a dishwasher at Bob's Big Boy, Bob's Big Boy, and pumping gas at the Esso station across the street and working as a weekend DJ in a country western station. And you could do that back then. I mean, tuition was cheap because 80% of the cost of college was paid for by state and federal money. And only 20% was what students paid as tuition. Today, as a result of 43 years of Reagan's policies, 80% of the cost of college is paid for with tuition and only 20% of state and federal funds. And that's why we have $2 trillion worth of student debt, which again, Reagan and the Republicans saw as a good thing because they thought this would cause young people to sober up and take seriously their role in society and stop, smoking pot and rebelling against the existing order. And then, Reagan, in fact, Reagan aggressively went after the student movement. 4 days before Kent State, he said publicly, if it takes a bloodbath to get this over with, let's have it. Bring it on. And of course, they did. 4 days later, they killed a bunch of people at Kent State. So the result, as I open the book with, is that when my generation, I'm a boomer, I'm in my 70s. When my generation was in my 30s, we're in our 30s, we controlled 21% of the nation's wealth. Today, people in their 30s control a little less than 5% of the nation's wealth. When I was young, when I was coming up, right up through the 80s, you could, with a single income, have a middle-class lifestyle. You could buy a house, you could buy a car every couple of years, you could take a vacation every year, you could have a decent retirement with a pension, you could put your kids through school. Today, it takes 2.3 incomes to produce that same lifestyle. And even at that, the wealth is not there. Also, when I was young, back in the 70s, I owned Louise and I had started an herbal tea company. And we had 18 employees, and we provided health insurance to all of them. We were able to do that. I remember we had Blue Cross Blue Shield, and it cost us $35 per month per employee. The reason why was because the law in Michigan at that time, and this is true of most states in the United States, was that both health insurance companies and hospitals had to be nonprofits. And of course, Reagan blew that up too. And so now the insurance, all three hospitals in Lansing are for-profit enterprises. All the insurance companies are run for a profit. And that's why Dollar Bill McGuire, the former CEO of United Healthcare, was able to walk off from his, when he retired with $1.65 billion, pretty much every penny of it made by saying to somebody, no, we're not going to pay for your kid's liver transplant. So that's where it all started and how we kind of got where we are. I'm sorry, you asked me what time it is, and I told you how to build a clock, but that's kind of the story there.
No, that's fine. Yeah, no, that definitely covers it for sure. But one of the things you do cover a little later in the book, and I think this is an important fact that we've lost sight of maybe as a country, is the role of unions in all this. And I think this is particularly interesting this year, given it's an election year, and the Teamsters, for the first time in I don't even know how long, maybe ever, are declining to endorse anybody. The head of the Teamsters spoke at the RNC. There's at least some surface level talk on the Republican side of supporting unions. First of all, maybe give a brief explanation of why unions were important to all this, but then also what are the Republicans up to with this? And just how does that fit in with the larger themes that you talk about in the book towards their, anti-union stance normally?
Yeah, Republicans are opposed to unions in general because they think of them as disruptive. Again, this is all, we want to have classes and orders and a nice, steady, stable society. When Reagan came into office, about 2/3 of America was in the middle class because about 1/3 of America had a union job. And the union jobs set the wage floor, the local wage floor. So, other employers had to compete with union employers. And so we had 2/3 of us, in that middle class. Reagan, of course, attacked the unions, went after the unions. And and so did the Supreme Court. And once the Supreme Court got taken over by Republicans in the early 1970s, the Supreme Court started really limiting the ability to unionize and the power of unions. And of course, you had Taft-Hartley, which was passed in 1947 over Harry Truman's veto, which for those states that adopted it, which is pretty much every red state now, makes it very difficult for unions to survive. So the consequence of that is that we've gone from 2/3 of us in the middle class when Reagan came into office to 43% of us being in the middle class today. And while high income taxes helped preserve the middle class, and they're gone. Reagan did away with that. He dropped the top income tax rate from 73% down, or 74% down to 25%. So-called free trade, Reagan pioneered this. And in fact, George Herbert Walker Bush wrote NAFTA, which Bill Clinton signed. And that caused some 15 million factories to leave the United States, and costing us, 50,000 factories, costing us 15 million jobs, moved to China and Mexico and whatnot. And this was an effort by employers to get away from American union labor because it was expensive. And that further kneecapped the middle class. When my dad, in the 40s and 50s, when my dad joined the middle class because he got a job in a tool and die shop and was able to join the machinists union, about 80% of employees who applied to the NLRB for union got a union. Just 10 years later, by 1990, as a result of Reagan's efforts, that number was down to 56%. And I haven't been able to find a good number, a good reliable number for where it's at now. But my guess would be it's probably in the neighborhood of 10 or 15%. Certainly, I mean, you had Donald Trump the other day congratulating Elon Musk on, not having unions and firing people when they tried to start unions. You've got the publisher of the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon, fighting unions. Basically the richest people in America don't want unions because unions take away a little bit of their wealth. So unions are absolutely essential to a middle class.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, the other, one of the other legs of the stool, of course, that you talk about here is the education system. That was very essential to the conditions from which middle class can even come from, right?
Yeah, my college tuition was, as I recall, around $200 a month, maybe $230 a month, or not a month, a semester. And and you could buy used books cheap, and it was just not it was easy. I mean, but Reagan saw to it that got changed. I didn't, in fact, I went to college from 68 to 69, basically. And I only knew one person who had any student debt at all, and he was working on his master's degree. So it just didn't exist. Of the 34 OECD countries, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is basically the club of wealthy nations in the world, of the 34 OECD countries, there is only one that has any consequential student debt. In fact, most of those OECD nations will pay you to go to college because, like we learned from the GI Bill, our experience with the GI Bill in the 50s and 60s, for every dollar the government invests in sending young people to college, the government receives a return over the lifetime of those people of an additional $7 in tax revenue that they wouldn't have gotten because college-educated people earn more than high school graduates. And so every other country in the world gets it. We're still, and Democrats for many years have been trying to bring back free college. Joe Biden, tried to forgive billions of dollars in student debt. And what happened? The 17 Republican attorneys general sued him, took it to the Supreme Court, and 6 Republicans on the Supreme Court said, "No, you can't do this, Biden. We want that student debt," which is nuts. I mean, we've got people paying 5, 6, 7% interest on student loans that by law, and this was a law that George Herbert Walker Bush passed in 2005, the Bankruptcy Reform Act, that by law cannot be discharged in bankruptcy. Prior to that, the only other thing that can't be discharged in bankruptcy is your taxes. So here you've got banks that have absolutely no risk whatsoever, and they're making obscene profits. And of course, they're using those profits to pay off mostly Republican legislators to keep things like it, keep them that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Your book made me very angry. not anything you did.
Yeah.
Like
No, I get it. I think
brings up,
education
it's
should
like,
be a right, not a privilege. And like
oh,
I said, it is in every other country. Just like with healthcare. I mean, we're the
yeah.
only
I
country
know.
in the developed world where anybody goes bankrupt because somebody got sick. We have 500,000 medical bankruptcies a year in America, and the total number of bankruptcies among the 34 OECD countries is, surprise, surprise, 500,000. They all happen here.
Wow. Amazing. Talk a little bit about this paradox that you talk about in the chapter on taxes in terms of, because obviously Republicans are very skilled at selling this to people, that tax cuts will affect every tax bracket the same. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is one of the most brilliant snow jobs that the GOP has run on us since the 70s, really, and in a big way since the 80s. I mean, Reagan was a big exponent of this. If you're rich, if you make a huge amount of money, odds are you have a fair amount of control over your income. And so, if your taxes go up, you can dial back your income, or if your taxes go down, you actually make more money. And average working people think, well, gee, if I get a tax cut, that's going to mean I have more money in the bank. The problem is it doesn't work that way for working class people. David Ricardo laid this out in his book On Labor back in 1805. I mean, it's not a surprise that there is a marketplace for labor. So let's say that you own a donut shop, and you're trying to hire somebody who's a competent donut maker, a guy to manage your store and make the donuts. And let's say that the market, and these are all just made up numbers. I have no idea what donut makers make, but let's say that you can hire somebody to make donuts for $30,000 a year. Well, if the income tax is such that person with a take-home pay of $30,000 a year has to pay about $10,000 in taxes, that means they need a gross salary of $40,000 a year. So you're the donut shop owner, you pay $40,000 a year, they take home $30,000 a year. Now, what happens if the Republicans come along and say, hey, we're going to cut your taxes, we're going to give a huge tax break to the billionaires, but you're going to get a $5,000 a year tax cut because we need your vote. So now that donut maker is taking home $35,000 a year. Well, the guy who owns the donut shop, you know that you can hire donut makers for 30 grand a year. So why are you going to keep this guy around? Or what you're going to do is, and typically you see these trends over a period of 3 to 5 years. What you're going to do is you're going to start reducing the salary from $40,000 a year down to $35,000 a year, so that he's still taking home $30,000 a year. And we've seen that since 1981, as there have been tax cuts for middle class people. Guess what's happened? Wages have gone down. That's why it takes two incomes now to do what you could do with one income in 1981. The flip side of that is if your taxes go up, then, again, let's say that there was a $5,000 increase in your donut maker's taxes. So now he's only taking home 25 grand a year. Well, he's not going to work for 25 grand a year. He's going to go off looking for another job where he can make 30. So what do you have to do? You have to start paying him, instead of $40,000 a year, you have to start paying him $45,000 a year, because now he's paying $15,000 a year in taxes. And that's what we saw in the era from 1932 right up until 1980, was that until Reagan started cutting taxes, was that as taxes go up, so do wages for working class people. Again, it's the opposite for rich people. But that's why the period from 1932 to 1981 saw the fastest increase in income, in gross income, in the history of America, because it also saw the fastest increase in income taxes. And a large part of that was to pay for World War I and World War II, but still, it was there. And when you understand that simple principle, it just all makes sense. But so many people, believe the BS that the GOP has been shoveling out that, hey, you average guy, you really need a tax cut, and so that we can give 85% of the tax cut to the billionaires. But don't worry, we'll give you 15% of it. You deserve it. And people are like, yeah, I want a tax cut. I want a tax cut. Not realizing that if they get a tax cut this year, within 3 years, they're going to see their paycheck go down.
Well, and I think the one thing that, at least economically, the Republicans have been brilliant at selling people on is like, don't screw this up for yourself in case you ever happen to be rich.
Yeah. Yeah.
Don't ever vote. Like, people are always like, don't vote against your interests. And it's like, yeah, but that's if you think your interests are actually your interests. If you think your interests are the person you'd like to be's interests, then you know what I mean?
Yeah, this is the incredible scam. They've got average working people thinking of taxes as if they were billionaires, or at least multimillionaires, as if as if they had just won the lottery.
Wow, what a trick!
It is. It's just incredible, and they pulled it off, and it's been working for them for 40 years now.
Oh, 100%. Another aspect of this that ties into all of this is housing, and just the cost of housing, and these private equity firms that are buying up all the residential housing in the country and, squeezing out anyone that actually wants to get a home. I mean, that wasn't not a thing back, a couple decades ago, right? I mean,
mostly, you're absolutely right. It mostly became a thing in 2008. One of the big banks, when the housing market crashed, one of the big banks wrote a white paper saying, hey, now's a great time for hedge funds and big banks to get into the housing market and buy up single family homes, take them off the marketplace, turn them into rental properties, and jack up the rent until you hit price resistance. And so now we've got millions and millions of American homes that are owned by banks and hedge funds, and they're buying, $1 million a year or thereabouts. I mean, it's just huge. And what that has done is it's dramatically increased the cost of housing, thus producing a homelessness crisis in the United States, and making it damn near impossible for young people, starting out, to even afford what used to be called a starter house, a fixer-upper, or just a little tiny house. So we've got basically an entire generation, the Zoomers, and in large part the millennials, who are kind of doomed to be renters for most of their life, which is crazy because housing is one of the best ways to build equity. Other countries have figured out how to deal with this. Canada, for example, had a big problem with Chinese billionaires buying Canadian housing and sitting on it as investments. And so what they do, they said, if you want to buy a house here in Canada and you're not a Canadian citizen, you got to live in it. We could easily do that. I mean, we've got a big problem. We've got 14 million empty homes in the United States. Most of them are speculative. Most of them are investment houses, and we've got about 1 million, homeless people. Those numbers are crazy. So what I advocate in the book is, number one, that we curtail foreign investment in housing, and number two, that we say to the big banks and the hedge funds and frankly everybody else, if you want to own 2 houses or 3 houses or even 4 or 5 houses, that's fine. But beyond that, no, you can't do it. Sorry, housing is not just a commodity. Housing is a human right. And we would not be an outlier in the world if we did that. We are actually, right now, we are the outlier in that we don't regulate housing in the United States.
Another pillar to all this that, let's talk about it. The Democrats have some blame to share in the dissolution of the American dream, frankly, and its possibilities for people because of, the hollowing out of manufacturing, for example, with things like NAFTA that, Clinton signed, and neoliberalism and, free trade. Talk a little bit about that too, because, this is a bipartisan issue, because I feel like part of the reason Trump was able to take hold a little bit is because, the Democrats embraced this idea and kind of left people in the lurch in the, industrial Midwest.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I mentioned that in the book. And I actually wrote an entire other book, The Hidden History of Neoliberalism, just about this.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened was they started pitching, Friedman and Hayek and those guys started pitching neoliberalism back in the 50s, and Reagan was the first guy to really embrace it, put it into law, particularly the free trade aspect of it. What built America actually was tariffs. George Washington put the first tariffs on, and we had fairly high tariffs from the founding of the republic right up until the 1960s, 50s, and 60s, and arguably the 70s. And the neoliberals said, let's have national borders prevent the movement of people, but not the movement of corporations or money. So corporations are now free to go anywhere in the world and find the cheapest labor they can. Jack Welch, the former CEO of General Electric, famously said, if I could just build my factory on a barge and move it from country to country, always in search of the cheapest labor, I'd do it. And that's essentially what's happened. And that's kind of the bad news. And Bill Clinton bought into it. Reagan sold it. George Herbert Walker Bush actually wrote the NAFTA agreement. Bill Clinton signed it. He bought into the neoliberalism. George W. Bush continued it. Barack Obama continued it. They were all neoliberals, and of course Donald Trump, argued against it. And I think you're absolutely right. It's one of the main reasons he got any votes at all in 2016 was because he pointed out the stupidity of this. And he tried putting tariffs on, but he just did it stupidly. He just slapped, absurdly high tariffs on a small number of things. If you're going to do tariffs, you need to do them gradually. You need to do them thoughtfully. You need to do them targetedly, if that's a word. And you need to do them in a way that if you're trying to encourage people to build factories in the United States to employ people here with good union wages, you're going to have to convince employers that tariff, which is going to protect them, is going to be in place for the next 20 years. I mean, who's going to put $1 billion into a factory if they don't know that they're going to get a return on their investment over time? And Trump didn't do any of that stuff. If I said Reagan, I meant Trump. I might have misspoken. So Trump's tariffs were just idiotic. But the good news to all this, Rob, is that Joe Biden gets it. I mean, he's put a whole bunch of tariffs on things. He just put 100% tariff on Chinese electric cars, for example. He's increased a number of tariffs. He's actually the first Democrat since Jimmy Carter. Well, really, since Lyndon Johnson. Jimmy Carter was flirting with neoliberalism when he deregulated the railroads and the airline industry. But Joe Biden is the first Democrat since Lyndon Johnson to reject neoliberalism and re-embrace Keynesian economics or FDR's economics. And you see the result of it. We've got the strongest economy we've had since the 60s, and we're even strong enough to resist going into a recession when the Fed jacks interest rates up to 5%, which has, in my lifetime, every single time the Fed has done that, we've gotten a recession. We're not getting a recession this time, at least so far, knock wood, because Biden is doing he's doing the stimulus from the bottom up, building projects, construction projects, all these kind of things, and he's incentivizing the construction of new factories, the CHIPS Act, and stuff like that, and he's working. He's the first president to walk a picket line. I mean, this is just a wonderful thing that Biden and Harris have rejected neoliberalism. They've rejected Reaganism and frankly, rejected Clintonism. And they're going back to what worked. We had a 50-year experiment that proved it worked. Now we've had a 43-year experiment of the opposite that shows that, this whole Republican strategy is craziness. So there you go.
Right. Well, I could, talk to you for many more hours about this and many other things, but we are running out of time here. But I appreciate you taking all this time to talk about all this. The one question I do ask, as you know, at the end is, what music have you been listening to lately?
My wife has been producing music for our radio show as bumper music lately.
Nice.
She's been writing songs based on my daily rants, and then the music part of those songs has been being done by AI. And weirdly enough, she's produced some pretty good songs.
Wow.
They're all over on my website, hartmannreport.com, and you can hear them on my show every day. So that's the music I'm listening to nowadays. It's Louise's music.
I can truly say that's a first for that answer. So, okay.
There you go.
Great. Excellent. Well, thank you for taking the time again, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Rob, thank you so much for having me on your program. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, have a good night.
You too.
Bye-bye.